Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Just in case, I see we got 4 people here already, which is fantastic. Just in case there's folks who are new here, this is different from the public live cast. I'm not doing a big presentation. Basically, I'm just going through the list of 12 items you might have seen on the YouTube channel or on Twitter. I don't know if it's 12 items. It just sticks in my head. There's a dozen items or whatever. I go through those items piece by piece, say what little I have to say on it, and then with 4 people, up to 10 people, which I don't think has ever quite happened yet, I answer every single comment, and whatever you might have to say on that topic, I will engage with it. That's the beauty of the patrons only newscast. We've usually only got like 5 to 10 folks here, so we can really have more of a conversation than just me sort of like scrambling through the very quickly scrolling comments trying to make sense of it. So yeah, good to see. Oh, it's interesting. Now we're down to 1. That's strange. Well, YouTube is always confusing. It sounds like there's people there. Folks I recognize: Loga, Christopher Murtaugh, and Black Metal Silly. Did I pronounce that appropriately? Anyway, good to see you folks. Let's get to it. I think the first thing I wanted to talk about was the Biden go-round, the good, the bad, and the stupid. And it's interesting. Let me know if you guys think this, but I was asking myself this morning as I was going through this, it's like, am I being too easy on Joe Biden? Am I being too light on him? Am I too willing to make excuses for him, whereas I wasn't for Donald Trump? And I think that's a very real, legitimate concern. And I think that watching my content over the past month, you could get that sense. Please let me know if that's the vibe you guys are getting. The thing with me is I consciously, I think I put this in a family Christmas card. I don't know if I ever put it out on the channel. I am consciously giving Joe Biden time before I start getting very angry and vocal about policies that he is adopting, because it really is early days at this point. And I think I've said, like, I'm not going to start really flipping out about anything until April. I mean, because the guy is still in the process of trying to hire the people in his administration. And unlike Trump, who would really just never actually nominate anybody, he's got nominees waiting. They're waiting to be cleared by the Senate. And that also, I think, impacts the stream of policy news that comes out. Because we have to keep in mind that what these people in the Biden administration are saying publicly is very often something that they're saying to keep from getting blocked by Republicans or blocked by more militarist Democrats. So I think, in particular, I think it was the confirmation hearing of Wendy Sherman, who's a woman who helped negotiate the Iran nuclear deal. And when she was in a job interview, auditioning for her job in front of Republicans and militarist Democrats, she was saying things that were not as inspiring or hopeful about the Iran nuclear deal as we would have hoped. And obviously, we should zero in on that. We should look at any possible indication of what the Biden administration is thinking. But yeah, like when a person is auditioning for a job in front of people who desperately want to keep tensions with Iran as high as possible, obviously what she's going to say in that context, I'm not saying she's lying to them, but obviously what she's going to emphasize and choose to say in that context may not be fully representative of what she believes. So I think that's the case, like, sort of across the board. It is too early to get super angry about Joe Biden's policies, I think. We're going to do a little bit of that today, getting angry about Joe Biden's policies. But I think we do have to keep in mind that it's early. Christopher Murtaugh says, don't feel like you're too easy. We all need a psych readjustment after that dumpster fire. Biden wasn't my choice, but he's a vast improvement. Give some time for a gauge to readjust. Local Costume says, yes, I think you are. No offense. My support for him is almost solely to avoid war with Iran. I demand to know exactly what is stopping him from rejoining, GCPOA. So we've got a diversity of opinion there. Loga thinks that I am being too kind to Biden. So I think there's a number of factors that are thus far keeping me um, from freaking out. There's the thing that I do emphasize, and I think I've emphasized in multiple live chats, and have now, yeah, in last Tuesday's video. You have to understand this is not a negotiation with Iran. This is a negotiation with absolutely everybody else in Washington, D.C. Trump was real, loved to sort of pretend, do make believe that, oh, I'm the decider. I can do whatever I want. And in some cases, that was true. If you're going to destroy something as a president, it's very easy to be the decider. If you're going to say, oh, no, we're not doing Paris anymore. Oh, no, we're not doing the Iran nuclear deal anymore. That's real easy. Unfortunately, with the way that the system works, the process of jumping back into things and making things better is infinitely more difficult. And what it is basically Biden needs to pick and choose what he can work on at any given time. And obviously, his focus right now is the stimulus, is coronavirus. He has foreign policy people who are working to get things done. The thing is, he's not, and Logan, this was the point that I was making with the Wendy Sherman confirmation hearings. There are aspects of, at this point, Blinken's been confirmed. You should get really angry about things that Blinken says about the Iran nuclear deal. That's entirely fair. But if someone's in a Senate confirmation hearing and like you're seeing angry tweets about what she or he says about Iran policy, that doesn't make much sense. And the other thing here, and this is something that I'll get into, AUMF and drone policy, is there's a real, and I think Christopher Murtaugh got to this when he talked about just the insane dumpster fire. During the Obama administration, drone policy and the amount of people that we were killing, I think one of the most famous revelations towards the end of the Obama administration was that the Pentagon was just counting everybody they killed as an enemy combatant. Like, as long as they weren't like confirmed to be like, innocent women or children or whatnot, they were just, basically assuming that everybody they killed was an enemy combatant, was somehow a bad guy, even though there's no evidence to support that. Like, that's one of the stories that came out during the Obama administration, because people were actually paying attention. During the Obama administration, the drone war, what was going on with the war in Yemen, these were things that were discussed more regularly in media in general. Some of this has to do with biases between Democrats and Republicans, but also it's just because we had the fucking time. We had the ability to focus on stuff other than the Trump dumpster fire. Something that I certainly didn't talk enough about on this channel, but is well documented, is that while Trump did not get into any new wars, which is a fantastic thing, he did dramatically enhance the viciousness, brutality, and violence of every war that we were involved in. In every arena, be it Somalia, Yemen, Afghanistan, casualties went through the roof. He stopped any kind of oversight from the executive branch. He just said, well, let the Pentagon do what the Pentagon wants to do. And that very half-assed, nowhere as powerful as it should have been, oversight from the media that did exist during the Obama administration went to, oh, what's Trump's racist tweet instead. So basically, for the past 4 years, all of these things about the forever war, all of these things about the war on terror have been let completely off the hook to just go nuts. And the Biden administration is trying to all at once do all of these things, but you have to keep in mind there's the political question. Biden can't, he physically can't, politically can't just say, oh, we're gonna do everything the way that Rob and Logo Cool Extreme wants it to be. For one thing, there isn't, Joe Biden is a centrist Democrat. He's not as interested in anti-intervention as we are at the More Freedom Foundation, but he is definitely interested in a saner, gentler, less nightmarishly bad forever war. And I think that 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, a year into the Biden administration, we can see where Biden is on that, and we can get very angry and go after um, that for being insufficiently sane, insufficiently sensible. But at this point, we just don't really know what Biden's gonna do. So I think over the course of this talk, we're going to go through a lot of stuff that Biden is falling down on, but I do think it is just too early. And if Biden wants to fix things with Iran, if Biden wants to get into the JCPOA, he's got to fight like a whole range of interests. Defense companies, Israel, UAE, Saudi Arabia, all at the same time. So he can't at the same time fix Venezuela, Latin America policy and go against every Latino in Florida. He's gotta pick his battles, and I think we have to be conscious of that, which is one reason why I think I'm a little more sympathetic. Sorry to have disappointed Loga on that. Christopher Murtaugh says, I agree that Biden is screwing this up, but I'm not surprised either. He's a dinosaur, and foreign policy was probably his weakest point. Yeah, I think that's fair. And honestly, my expectations for a Biden administration, what I'll consider outrageously successful, is an end to the Yemen war and the U.S. rejoining the JCPOA and avoiding a $1 trillion war with Iran. That's my goal for outrageous success. If we get some of the other things that are beginning to be promised, like revision of the AUMF, a dialing back of the drone war, then okay, I can start to get a little more excited. But again, I don't know that we can even really say that Biden is screwing this up yet. Really, only a month and a half into his administration. There were stories over the past week that got me very angry. And then I reflected a little bit. I was like, okay, is this a part of a nomination process? What else is Biden doing this week that might be a little more sane? Things like that, fixing the world takes a lot more time than okay, that's a tremendously arrogant way to, but fixing, what's wrong with U.S. foreign policy is always going to take dramatically more time and effort than fucking it up worse. And I do think there are people within the Biden administration. There are plenty of people within the Biden administration who are oriented towards keeping things as fucked up as they are, but I think there are plenty of good people in the administration working to make things less fucked. And I think literally 40 days in, 40, 50 days in is too early to get angry. I think Local Cool Extreme and I are Christopher Murtaugh says are pretty close. I just understand trying to measure Biden's failures is difficult with the precedents set by the previous regime. Brando Commando says, hello, haven't tuned in for a while. Welcome, Brando Commando. It's good to see you. Christopher Murtaugh says, counterpoint, we Malaysians elected a man 15 years older than Biden, and he could make a radical change in our government. That's very true. But did Mahathir Mohamad, did I pronounce that right, Loga? Did he run essentially promising not to change the government, promising to restore it to 4 years back? Because that is what Biden's mandate is. Biden's mandate is to sort of make little tiny changes at the margins and be less loud on Twitter. That's kind of what Biden was elected to do. He was not, unfortunately, elected to do a dramatic overhaul. More freedoms. I just realized it's been a month of me actually giving a shit about Trump. God, it feels so good. Yes, does feel very good that Donald Trump is no longer at the center of this. Because what's interesting, as we'll get to in just a second when we start talking about Yemen, is this is finally a chance on a lot of things to get into the details, to get into the nitty gritty. We've known for 5 years, for 4 solid years. I mean, we knew under the Obama administration, and by the end of the Obama administration, they were taking steps to correct this. But we have known half-assed, crappy steps. But we have known that U.S. Yemen policy has been a horrific dumpster fire. We've known this for 4 solid years now. But under Trump, there was nothing to really be done about it because the United States was committed to not taking a positive role in that. Trump, whether he was bribed by the Saudis or just, hates poor people and likes bombing them, he was 100% behind one approach to the Yemeni war that was a dramatic failure on every dimension, from humanitarian costs to, actual U.S. and Saudi aims of containing Iran and the Houthis. Like, it's a complete utter failure. And now we do have a reset to a degree, but again, it's like it's complexity. I would prefer to just pull the U.S. out of there entirely. Tell the Houthis, like, look, like, stop violating the Saudi border. The embargo's over. We're out. Biden has made the decision. The Biden administration has made the decision that that's probably not going to be a possibility if they want to get back into the JCPOA. Not sure that's necessarily true, but that's the context that they're working in, and also something that I was never really much of a priority for me. It seems like the Biden administration actually might want to help end the Yemen war, which isn't really something that I've cared that much about. I was more get the U.S. out of there. The Houthis are going to win. Who cares? The Biden administration seems to want to actually be negotiating Yemen and diving in on that. Okay, so I think I'm already into my next item here. Let's see if I've hit any questions I missed. Mert Muftio says, "Hi, yes, I was feeling pretty happy until CPAC when Trump surfaced again. It is a good feeling." But what's fun is that, like, the CPAC thing, you didn't have to watch it. You didn't have to engage with it. He wasn't the president anymore. Just seems great. For those who don't know, Trump basically came out of hiding for the first time to give a big speech at CPAC and whine about Biden and whine about Republicans that weren't loyal enough to him. And you know what? We don't have to talk about him. Hopefully, that'll be the only time he'll be mentioned. Any of his current actions will be mentioned in this podcast. Of course, we have to talk about Trump's policy legacy. Logo Cool Extreme says, "Speaking of the Iran war, what's the progress on Iran's nuclear breakout capacity right now? How close are they to making a nuke?" That is, I have no idea. That's like, there's a million different answers to that question. It's also an incredibly complex technical question. I think there are a lot of people, even, both primarily on the sort of pro-war, pro-tensions with Iran side of things, who want to tell you that, there's this, we know exactly they have 6 months to this breakout, or 2 months to this breakout, or 3 months to breakout. And the more I read about it, the more of a sense I get that we don't fucking know. That's a sort of unknowable thing that people tend to assume is very concrete. I hear some people say that, look, Iran has all the knowledge they need. Maybe they already have a nuke somewhere, or then there's other folks who are like, oh, I don't know. I just don't know. And I can't speak to that. That's an extraordinarily scientific and technical question. So Yemen. Like I said, my choice for Yemen was always say, F the Saudis, we'll make sure you're safe, because I am not a fan of the Houthis taking over southern Saudi Arabia. I do not like borders being violated. But otherwise, just saying we're done, the embargo's over, and we're not giving Saudi any more weapons at all. That is not what has happened. What Joe Biden did very early on was he came out and said, we're not going to support offensive actions by Saudi Arabia in Yemen anymore. The definition of that can be absolutely anything. And I think the really crucial question here, and something that I got, this probably would have been a loudly anti-Biden presentation if it weren't for one really key story that came out in Reuters about 2 days back. All of the links for this are in the description. There's links for most of the stories we're going to talk about today in the video description if you want to do more reading. But this Reuters story made it clear that the new United States envoy to Yemen, Tim Lenderking, is speaking directly to the Houthis. And this is a big fucking deal, because one of the real fundamental, I may do a public video on this, because this is pretty important, but I want a little more solidity behind this, because Reuters has basically got second. I mean, I don't doubt the story, but it seems like the Biden administration is willing to acknowledge that uh, Yemen has a government that is not the official Saudi-backed government. And this is huge. One of the really frustrating things about the Yemen conflict is, if you took the time to get to learn about it, was the fact that the UN resolution that was given to Saudi Arabia in April of 2015 by the Obama administration, largely as a trade to get them to shut up about the Iran nuclear deal that the Obama administration wanted to do, is very flatly anti-Houthi. It says, and this is an unanswerable comment that I get from Saudis in the comments to Yemen videos, is that the UN resolution very, very clearly says the Houthis need to knock it off. The Houthis are the problem. The Houthis, the Houthis, the Houthis, the Houthis, and they need to defer to the international government. The problem, unlike the Libya UN-sponsored, internationally focused government that has always had control over most of the population and wealth centers, control in Libya is, of course, a little more debatable, but has had a real power on the ground. The UN sponsored, because of the JCPO and the Obama administration gave this to the Saudis, the UN sponsored official international government of Yemen has always been a Saudi puppet based in Riyadh. There have been momentary attempts to get President Hadi, a guy who was he ever elected? Or was he just appointed in like 2012 and his term ended in 2014? But whatever, this guy like briefly spent a moment in Aden, which is a large southern Yemeni city, the only one that's not controlled by the Houthis, until southern separatists kicked him out as well. So this is not a government that exists, but it is a government that is given all kinds of international credit that it does not deserve. Control over the oil revenues that Yemen has, which are small. Control over the Yemeni central bank. Like, it is an absurd amount of power that is given to this government in exile in Riyadh. And a really key part of this is that sort of the official peace processes in Geneva, and I think there was some other, there've been rounds and rounds and rounds, are always sort of between the Houthis and between this internationally recognized government, which is a fucking farce, which makes absolutely no sense. It's absurd that the Houthis that have always controlled. I think, yeah, this is from Bruce Bridell, who's an analyst at Brookings Institution, who I do respect. And he said in an article this week, they have always controlled 80% of Yemen's population. Again, on the map, looks like a lot less because, deserts. But yeah, the Houthis have always controlled 80% of Yemen's population. And according to like official UN-sponsored negotiations, they're supposed to deal with this government in exile that doesn't even control the other 20%. The other 20% is controlled mostly by local actors, and the next biggest actor is the Southern Transition Council, which controls Aden and a lot of the at least controls Aden, which is the biggest non-Houthi city in Yemen. So what's so exciting about this Reuters article, what's so exciting about what the Yemen envoy is doing, is he is negotiating directly with the Houthis, which just makes so much fucking sense. And it's nice to see something in Yemen that makes so much fucking sense. So while I, as a YouTuber, kind of like the idea of the US just being like, fuck it, we're out. I think there are reasons why I could see myself deferring to the experts on this one a bit, if those experts are moving in an appropriate direction and actually talking to the Houthis, actually trying to craft an agreement between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis. Just makes so much sense, and is absolutely like the right thing to do at this point. So yeah, like that's something that I found tremendously heartening that the Biden administration is doing is like cutting through those layers of bullshit in a real way. And yes, I want to see real results. I want to see the lifting of the embargo. What's going on in Yemen right now, I've talked about before, is the Marib offensive, the only place where elements of the internationally approved government have any control is a town out in the middle of the desert that is close to the oil resources called Marib. The Houthis have besieged Marib for years now, have been on the outskirts trying to get at least since I think 2018 was the last big military flare up around Hodeidah. That's the coastal city. Marib is in sort of in the desert, and basically, if the Houthis get Marib, then it there's no. The Saudis just have no access to any of Yemen, basically. What the Saudis do have is a base that they've built out in the desert on the far east towards the sort of Omani border. I do wonder that that may actually end up being there long term. We'll see how negotiations go between Saudis and the Houthis. But like, if they're pushed out of Marib, that's it for the Saudis there. So the Houthis, and this is an interesting purchase point for me to see myself at. Like the Houthis are, they know they're winning. They know that real negotiations are coming. So what they're doing is they're doing a massive push to take Marib. And Marib, I think this is often overstated. You'll find that whenever somebody the U.S. doesn't like is trying to take a place, I find that it turns, the numbers of internally displaced persons, of refugees that are at risk, are somehow always massively inflated. But there are figures saying that there's something on the order of 2 million refugees in this desert oasis, which seems hard to credit to me, but maybe the case. I think that the official position of the Biden administration is that the Houthis should knock it off and not take Marib. And I weirdly, because I've been pretty during the Trump administration against the Trump Saudis, I was pretty objectively pro-Houthi. At this point, it would be nice if the dying stopped, and I think the Houthis at this point see just what a great position they're in and want to be in the final position for negotiations. And of course, if they do take Marib, then it's a negotiation between the Houthis and the Southern Transition Council at that point. What little facsimile of a position that the Hadi government has is gone. But we shouldn't want more war. We should want a ceasefire. And of course, as this offensive goes on, the embargo continues. So yeah, it would be nice if the Houthis and the Saudis were talking and we could get some kind of end of the attack on Marib in return for a lifting of the embargo that has killed probably hundreds of thousands of Yemenis over the past 6 years. It's unrealistic for the Biden administration to expect this offensive to stop before that embargo is lifted. I think that's the Houthi position. I think that's accurate. But yeah, do you see what I'm talking about? Now we're talking about like UN resolutions and what's actually happening on the ground in Marib and how that interacts with the UN envoy and the US envoy, and it's all gotten so much more complex, and it's amazing. It is amazing that it has gotten to the point where we're actually talking about like envisioning a possible ending to this. Because under Trump, it was just like Saudis do what they want, slaughter, 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 slaughter. I think, was it something like, maybe things changed by the end, but I think it was at some point during late in the Trump administration, like 2019, 2020, it was like two of his three vetoes of any congressional legislation were to continue backing the Saudis unconditionally in Yemen. So yeah, I think I'm tremendously optimistic about what's happening in Yemen. Are they doing exactly what I would do? No, but it's a really happy sign that we're to the point of complexity here, that we're to the point of like maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's making for boring content, me sort of hemming and hawing about, what's happening in Yemen. And that's fucking amazing. That's great. Okay, I think that's enough Yemen. Any statements on that? Christian Murtaugh says, sadly, despite Khashoggi-inspired public moratorium by Trudeau, we're silently back to selling to the Saudis. Trudeau has no shame. Need arms, try ours. Ceasefire is bad for business. Jesus, I didn't realize that. That the Canadian, it's interesting because we still don't know what it actually looks like. I bet there's some, well, certainly the Saudi UAE position, and maybe some in the Biden administration who agree that defending Marib, a city in Yemen, from the Houthis is still technically defensive. So I don't even know how, like, Christopher Murtaugh, a Canadian, you can be angry at your leaders for selling arms to the Saudis and the UAE, but I'm not even entirely certain that Biden has stopped at all, has made any real, there's not any kind of clarity on what that actually means, though he did at the beginning of February officially say we're no longer going to support Saudi offensive actions in Yemen, and that includes arms sales. We don't have any clarity on what that actually means yet. Oh, cool. Extreme says 2 million refugees if they take Marib. I looked it up. As of 2005, the last time Yemen had a census, it had 16,000 people, and the entire governorate has 500,000 people in 2011. So that, yes, Logo, that is very true, and I think a very good point. The parallel here is Raqqa in Syria, which, if you look at the 2000, well, not 2011, if you look at the 2010 figures for Raqqa in Syria, this was famously the Syrian capital of the Islamic State, the second biggest city that the Islamic State controlled. If you look at the 2010 figures before the civil war started, its population was similar to what Logo was talking about. From it was bigger than that, but it was like a couple 100,000 people, or maybe under 100,000 people. It wasn't that big. But what happened to Raqqa, and what I would buy happened to Marib as well, is that as the civil war swept across, Marib was sort of enough out of the way, as Raqqa, also a sort of desert oasis city, was enough. Raqqa in Syria was enough out of the way that it became a big hub for relief organizations and refugee camps. So yeah, while it's 100% true. I mean, this is sort of like this is Saudi Arabia holding on by its fingernails, because this is sort of the last city at the edge of the desert, or rather last big city at the edge of the desert. This is like middle of nowhere, but because it's middle of the nowhere, it means it was far enough away from the large-scale Saudi bombing, the large-scale Houthi troop movements, the fighting, the whatnot, that Marib did become a large center of refugees and internally displaced people. I totally believe that. What I am cynical about is whether it's really 2 or 3 million people. And yeah, as Logan just pointed out, I mean, if it was a place that literally just had 600,000 people, it really strains credulity that taking that city center is going to jeopardize 2 or 3 million people for sure. But I do think the Houthis have to recognize that they do have someone who's more willing to work with them in the Biden administration, actually sending envoy to talk to them. And the Houthis might not want to miss this opportunity in the name of just sort of, completing the fight through military means, because we want to get negotiations started. As touching as it touching is not the word. As much as I'd like the idea of Hadi's government just getting crushed, I think that will actually make things more complex, because then we have the Houthis with a completely united north facing down a south that may or may not, I haven't thought this through myself, may or may not have reasonable claims to autonomy. And it's like, who knows? Like, maybe if the Saudis are crushed entirely, then you've just got the Houthis who can then steamroll into southern Yemen. One of the things about the Houthis is that, like, they've got a kind of legitimacy very debatable. A lot of people hate the Houthis, but like they are the reason the Houthis exist is because they are sort of the successors to the Zaidi Shia group that has ruled Yemen for 1,000 years. But the coastal areas, southern Yemen, is predominantly Sunni. So if the Houthis rampage into southern Yemen, do all kinds of atrocities, and take that over, they also lose some legitimacy because they go from like becoming, in Yemen as large, I think is like 40%. Don't quote me on these exact quotes, but it's Yemen entirely, Zaidi Shias are like 40%. In northern Yemen, Zaidi Shia are like 55%. I don't quote me on those numbers. That's so yeah, like I don't know that we necessarily want the Houthis to be able to rampage into the south, even though those folks are UAE proxies. So I don't know. I am invested in wars stopping. And now there is a potential for the war stopping. While it's very understandable that the Houthis want to finish off what's left of this insulting, ridiculous Saudi puppet government, I'm not sure more death is better. So say that. Also, some latest news: Senate Majority Leader Joe Manchin has finally passed his stimulus package. Enjoy the. Oh, that's exciting! $1.9 trillion. Welcome to the Roaring '20s, folks. Let's see how long it lasts. But that is quite something. And who knows? With the stimulus out of the way and vaccines looking possible, who knows? Maybe March is the month that Biden really buckles down on foreign policy. I would be surprised. I think there's plenty of more domestic stuff to work on. But who knows? Okay, so that's Yemen done. Drone war and AUMF. I think AUMF is just something that came out yesterday. Drone war is a fascinating story. I think I linked it in the description. Is a New York Times story from a couple days back. Biden secretly limited the drone war, which I think more than anything else, I think that the fact that Joe Biden had to secretly limit the death from above wedding bombing aspect of the U.S. military should give you a sense of like what anybody who's a restrainer, a peace advocate, a sanity advocate in the Biden administration is working against. So basically, outside of the official war zones, I think probably Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, and Afghanistan at this point. I don't know. The U.S. drone program has been curtailed. So that means we're not just going to deniably murder people in, places like Pakistan or Sudan or the Sahel. Deniably in the Sahel, it's not like anybody even notice. So that's that is if that's really what's happening, because this is all sources. New York Times is a fantastic institution, but that doesn't mean that they're New York Times reporting is a fantastic institution, but that doesn't mean that they don't need to talk about their editorial board or Rome or whatever. But that doesn't mean that they can't be snowed by planted stories by the Biden administration. But isn't it nice to be dealing with an administration that has the ability to plant bullshit stories? Like basic competence, even when it comes to swindling the American people. It's nice. But I'm not saying that's necessarily what's happening here, because there's a certain plausibility to it that the Biden administration would have to sneak around and surreptitiously stop blowing up weddings in countries with brown people. Like that's fucked up, but also surprisingly plausible. And in the story itself, it makes it clear that this isn't like we're done with the death from above. No, they're just reviewing it. And that's another thing that's going to be really disappointing for people from my perspective from the sort of official MFF perspective. They're just reviewing it. They could decide, actually, this is a category of people that we want to assassinate. which is just ridiculous. The fact that quiet assassination from above in multiple countries, not in multiple countries beyond the 7 countries we're actively at war in, is fucking insane. But it's something that the Cold War public, the Cold War CIA, would have been outraged by. Oh my God! Well, maybe after the Church Commission, this would be something that would really shock the conscience of people involved in the Cold War. Yet for vastly lower stakes, assassination is like such a normal part of what the U.S. government does now that that an incoming presidential administration has to keep it a secret that they're not doing as much of it. It's just fucking insane. But that's another positive check mark for the Biden administration, that they might actually want to put a little bit of conscious thought into who we're assassinating in countries we're not at war with. The other thing that's interesting is the AUMF. And then, of course, it ties directly to the drone war because it is the authorization for the use of military force that justifies all of this. There are at least 2 and maybe 3 separate AUMFs. There's the blanket one that was from a couple days after 9/11 back in 2001. I think Barbara Lee was the only congressperson who had the courage, the statespersonship, the really heroism necessary to stand up and be like, wait a second, guys, I'm pissed off. This seems as pissed off as you are, but this seems kind of insane. Like why would we do this? This is the initial AUMF. And that initial AUMF has been used to justify an insanely wide range of military activity by the US government. There's also I think it's the 2003 Iraq authorization for use of military force that I believe is still in force. And I think there's another one, perhaps in that article below, they'll mention it. So these things are famously have been stretched far, far, far beyond what they were intended to do, as Barbara Lee pointed out. They've also really just screwed with the way the Constitution is supposed to work. Outside of certain emergency contexts that, honestly, the United States has not experienced since like 1812, I guess 1941, Pearl Harbor, that was U.S. territory that was attacked. Outside of contexts like that, the U.S. Congress is supposed to approve abso-fucking-lutely. Actually, maybe I think it's defensible that the Obama administration took emergency action against our out-of-control proxy, the Islamic State, in 2014. I think that's defensible. Of course, why were we in the Middle East at all? And the Islamic State wouldn't have existed without both the Bush and Obama administration's activities. It's a separate question. But outside of emergency activities, according to the U.S. Constitution, Congress is supposed to have power over these things. Famously, in the Obama administration, he was theoretically open, to sort of giving the Congress back some real power. In the context of Syria intervention, he may have just decided to have a vote on a Syria intervention because he knew that it would lose in the Congress and he didn't want to do it. But the Biden administration seems to be making a serious acknowledgement that the authorization for the use of military forces are too old and don't make sense. Now, from the context of my perspective, and I assume the perspective of most people listening, we're going to be pissed off because I think the desired result of this AOMF thing, from the context of most people in Washington, D.C., including the Biden administration, is that they get a new, better AOMF that sort of gives them better cover to go do all the things that they're currently doing. And get ready to be disappointed, because that's the best case end state of this process. Probably the most likely end state of this process is that Congress sort of chickens out and says, why don't you just keep doing what you're doing? And the Biden administration says, well, fine, and does so. That's probably the most likely result, but the best case scenario here, from the perspective of the Biden administration and most of Washington D.C., is a new, better AUMF that might actually allow, might even allow the president to do more military adventuring, and that will piss me off, and you'll hear about it. But the very fact that we have a presidential administration that is consciously reviewing these actions with attorneys, building up justifications for it, examining US military action at all is an incredible step forward, because the Trump administration did not do that. It was literally Donald Trump with his Twitter thread making pronouncements that the Pentagon had to find a way to work around, and they were finding ways to work around. I think something that I do need to mention is Afghanistan. There's a May 1st withdrawal deadline, according to a deal that Trump people did sign with the Taliban. That's not going to happen, and that's a real failure for the Biden administration. I need to research that in a little more detail, and should definitely do a real produced video on it. We'll see if I get to it. But I don't think the Trump administration would have actually withdrawn by May 1st either, because we saw over and over and over again, most famously and especially with Syria, the way that the people that were working for Trump just ran circles around him, because nobody was actually looking at anything seriously. When Trump initially made Jim Mattis, a former general, his Secretary of Defense, a trend that unfortunately Biden has continued, the intention was Mattis is going to handle all this. That is not what the Biden administration's intent here is. The Biden administration does want to get in lawyers to look at this, and yes, what their goal is to give themselves better legal cover for all the death and destruction they want to do. But honestly, I think that so many of these actions, specifically in the more broader drone war, are so counterproductive and useless that like some of them will actually be curtailed. The AUMF will require some real thought and real public sector discussion. I don't know that anybody's going to pay attention to it, but like CNN, MSNBC, maybe even Fox News, I mean, Tucker Carlson's made this his wheelhouse now, we'll actually have to discuss what the authorization for the use of military force is. Why are we doing these things? Like that sort of thing. It's going to be something we're going to discuss. And it's not just going to be news about Trump's Twitter thread. So these things make me fairly hopeful. Okay. That's a good point. Local Cool Extreme makes a very valid point. God damn it. Without drones creating new terrorists, how do you expect to waste tens of billions in tax dollars? Don't you wait. Don't you worry. We're very, very good at that. We'll find out how. I mean, that's what the whole China great power competition thing is about, is the acknowledgement that the whole terrorism thing that the Pentagon mostly manufactured isn't really panning out the way we want it. They're not very good threats. So we gotta pretend China's a real threat to our interests. Local Cool Extreme says 10 viewers. Yeah, this is exciting. 9-10 people watching at a time. This is unprecedented. It's very cool stuff. Let's see. Christopher Murtaugh says, just reviewing it, making a greatest hits video. I'm not 100% sure what you're referring to. If you want to chime in what I'm talking about, that'd be good. Local Extreme says, regarding the AUMF, a Harris supporter once called Sanders a hypocrite for being a peaceful president when he voted for the AUMF. Is this criticism valid? Yes, it is. Bernie Sanders has become, yes, that criticism is 100% valid. I think Bernie Sanders would agree on that. Bernie Sanders, through a weird course of events in the second half of the past decade, became a political figure of international significance. In 2003, was he even in the Senate yet? Because I think he was a representative first. He was a crank. Like he was not somebody that anybody ever expected to have an interesting or at all worth paying attention to opinion on foreign policy. He was the Congress socialist, from weird little Vermont. I think does Vermont even have 1 million people? It's sort of a famous. I think New Hampshire is famously a bunch of rural-leaning libertarian types, and Vermont is famously a bunch of left-leaning hippies. That's oversold. I know some very, very conservative Republican types who very much live in and love Vermont. I have a wedding invitation for one of those. Actually, I just got. Yeah, I mean, Bernie Sanders in 2003 was, going to go along with the group in foreign policy so he could bend somebody's ear about a better child tax credit. Not a child tax credit, that's right wing, but trying to do something for unions. He was not as someone with an opinion on international relations. Even through 2016, it just wasn't something he focused on. Like, the only reason he ran in 2016 was to try to push Hillary Clinton left. Between 2016 and 2020, he actually did develop a real foreign policy team and a real set of sort of left-leaning policies and approaches. But yeah, not to defend it. Yeah, they're absolutely right. Bernie Sanders should have been against the wars in 2002, 2003. It's just, it's sort of like he wasn't really that big of a deal. And I think sort of that just underscores how extraordinary Barbara Lee. I think the only person in U.S. politics, sort of between 1990 and now, who'd ever conceivably deserve a statue would be Barbara Lee. Okay. Regarding the AUMF, okay, I got that. Christopher Murtaugh says, even Sanders admitted his fault. Only one person, my good friend Barbara Lee, was right on that issue. She was right, I was wrong, and so was everyone in the House. Okay, so I can assume that Sanders was still in the House rather than the Senate at that point. Brando Commando says, have you been following the collapse of the Lebanese economy? Massive inflation hit after the harbor explosion, and now the projections say the average person will make about $68 a month. Jesus Christ. Man, Lebanon, poor Lebanon. I made a video about Lebanon, 3 or 4 years ago. 4 years ago now. Just talking about how extraordinary it was that Lebanon had made it through, at that point, the 6 or 7 years of the Syrian civil war without blowing up. Basically, Lebanon, a country of 6 million people, 4 million people, had taken in like 2 million refugees from Syria. And basically, the only reason that the country had hung on without falling back into horrific warfare was because they had such strong memories of their horrific civil war between 1975 and 1990, and just did not want to do it. So it was an extraordinary feat of restraint and care that the Lebanese people did not fall back into a horrific civil war with Syria right next to and around it, essentially enveloping it. And then Israel. I mean, Lebanon has borders with Israel and Syria. And their border with Israel is obviously a very militarized one. Because Hezbollah occupies the sort of southern, whatever, I don't know if it's a half or a third or a quarter portion of Lebanon. And the fact that it had restrained itself from civil war was so heroic. But even before that massive, horrifying Beirut explosion, I had actually haven't been in particularly good touch with them. Haven't been very good touch with many of the people from Istanbul, but people I considered very good friends, even though I haven't spoken to them in years, were in that explosion in Lebanon, and really absolutely horrifying. I think one of the larger non-nuclear explosions that there has ever been. I think blessedly only killed a few dozen people, but a really really mostly firefighters, I think, but really just sort of destroyed downtown Lebanon, sort of knocked out every, not sorry, destroyed Beirut, knocked out windows for miles and miles. Really was something that Lebanon didn't need. On top of the fact, that was on top of the fact that for I think at least a year by the time that explosion happened, Lebanon, Lebanon's banking system had just completely fallen apart. Central banks um, have the privilege of being able to print their own currency, but what apparently the Lebanese central bank did was take out a whole bunch of debt, not in its own currency, but in US dollars. Lebanon is this weird thing that was allowed to have a sort of rich world banking system because it has a very wealthy diaspora that cares a lot about Lebanon, even if they don't want to be there, and would keep money in those banks and would treat it as a banking hub for the region. And at some point, a couple years back, that stopped working. It had a lot to do with the Syrian civil war in the country that's much larger than Lebanon and surrounds it entirely. Probably had something to do with Saudis being less happy with the Lebanese leadership. Many, many factors. But the banking system that had been a pillar of the Lebanese economy since they talked about Beirut back in the 1960s and 1970s as the Paris of the Mediterranean or the Paris of the Middle East, is gone. It's evaporating now. And Lebanon is just an extraordinarily beautiful culture, place, one of the more advanced, well, advanced isn't that's a loaded term, but sort of more Western leaning, but fascinating mix of cultures, sort of French speaking, English speaking, Arabic speaking, gorgeous women, attractive dudes if you're into that. Just amazing nightlife culture. I was there once, just sort of like dancing in an Ottoman palace with some of the most beautiful women I've ever seen. Like, it's awesome. And yeah, it's just such a profoundly unhappy place right now, and it makes me very sad. Um, so yeah, that's what I have to say about Lebanon. It's sad. I hope that was useful. Christopher Murtaugh says the drone policy. Yeah, just yeah, yeah. They're reviewing the drone policy to make a greatest hits video. No, like honestly, reviewing it, like government is big and war is big and stupid, and there's a lot of things going on. Like the Trump administration had no, like the Obama administration did horrific things in the drone war. They murdered a U.S. citizen with no due process. This is the Obama administration, and in a separate attack, murdered his teenage son. Like, just what the hell? Why not? Why not? Because you could maybe make a case for killing Anwar al-Awlaki. Many did. I certainly didn't. But murdering his teenage son in a different strike, also a U.S. citizen. There's no defense for that, but that's something the Obama administration did. But even with all of that, they had a system and an approach that guided that. The Trump administration and I'm not saying that there was anything good or positive about the Obama drone war policy. I'm just saying that like there was some kind of system there. There was some kind of basic control. All of that was given to the Pentagon, and probably to separate area commanders in the Pentagon, and just something that was going on autopilot for 4 years. So yeah, we just desperately need to know what the fuck is going on and have somebody in the executive branch, somebody who actually is supposed to be making decisions in our government, elected by the people, know what's going on with our drone policy. So yeah, like yeah, greatest hits compilation, like just the basics of like what's going on here is something we need to know. Okay. Christopher says the drone policy, they're just reviewing it. You had said sounds like political fluff, but we can hope it leads to progress. Oh, no question, to some degree it's political fluff, but like there was real scrutiny, there was real outcry about the drone policy during the Obama administration. There was none, even though it was drastically expanded during the Trump administration. Like, I welcome people paying more attention to it. even if nothing improves at all and it's just political fluff. Um, because yes, we can hope it leads to progress. Christopher Murtaugh says Lebanon has been an unfolding tragedy for the last 45 years. It's sad to see what it's happened. It is nightmares to see what's happened. Jesus. Local Cool Extreme says here's something depressing. In 1998, Lebanon's GDP per capita was 50% higher than Malaysia's. In 2019, Malaysia's GDP per capita was 50% higher than Lebanon's. That is very sad. And keep in mind, in 1998, like Lebanon was still recovering from a horrific 15-year civil war. Like those figures in 1973, 2 years before the beginning of Lebanon's civil war, were I'm sure it was much more extreme than that. Okay, drones and AMF. Okay, what the fuck? We've done the making the case for Biden. What the fuck was he doing bombing Syria? I did I think a Facebook and YouTube post about like, sure, there's a case for it. Yes, they're constantly negotiating with militarist elements in the U.S. government, but why did we have to bomb Syria, killing like 22 people? It's no good reason. The people we were attacking were, I believe it was an Iraqi militia, a popular mobilization force actor. I'm not sure if it was the same one as the guy, same one as the. Oh no, I think yeah. When we killed Soleimani, we also killed the leader of the popular mobilization forces. This is something I should do a video on. So I think I don't know if you guys follow Bad Empanada. He's a leftist YouTuber, does some funny stuff, a lot of stuff I find irritating. But I think he really made a name for himself by going after the Gray Zone Project and Max Blumenthal and that whole group of people, saying that they are too uncritically anti-American, which is, I think a brave and interesting thing for a leftist to come up and say, because he's like the Bad Empanada, the YouTuber. He's a fairly seems like he's a fairly hard leftist. He's got hour-long videos I didn't bother to watch defending Che Guevara, and seems to be even beyond dirtbag leftist. I have some fairly revolutionary credentials, but pointing out like, look, like the Chinese are still fucking doing genocide, and you shouldn't be making excuses for that. And Assad is still a very bad man, and you shouldn't be making excuses for that. And Qasem Soleimani is a bad man, and you shouldn't be making excuses for that. And I think that the critique is valid, and I think it makes a good point. And actually, it was very useful for me personally because I read a book by Max Blumenthal that I liked, and I don't follow the Gray Zone Project more generally, or follow them on Twitter. But like, he made a pretty convincing case that like the way that they talk about Venezuela is just an outright lie. It's sort of Maduro, like, and I've made videos to this effect, like, yeah, like Venezuela is being horribly abused by the United States right now, but like they also ran themselves into the ground. Like what Chavez and Maduro did to the state oil company was insane, and was just sort of acting on the assumption that the China boom in petroleum prices was permanent, which it did not prove to be. So it's valid. It's a good point that the Bad Empanada guy made. But one point that he made that has really stuck with me and really bothered me is like, you should stop talking about Qasem Soleimani and like his militias, like they saved us from the Islamic State, is sort of a throwaway line or something like that. But the thing is, they did. And I think an important way to think about this is to just think about the Kurds, okay? So the Kurds in Syria are justifying a lot of bad policy and will continue to justify a lot of really bad policy in the Biden administration. They're so heroic. They did such great work against the Islamic State, which is 100% true. I am, a big Turkey advocate. So the fact that these Kurds happen to be aligned with the PKK a terrorist organization that has killed somewhere, or conflict with has killed somewhere to the tune of 30 or 40,000 people in Turkey over the past 30 years. But I of course acknowledge that the Syrian Kurds did heroic work, saving Kobane, being the foot soldiers of the U.S. air war. Now, everybody acknowledges that, from hyper leftists to conservatives to certainly, everybody in the U.S. Congress that works for Raytheon wants us to work with the Kurds forever because they're such heroes and they did this heroic work against the Islamic State. And yes, I think that it is unequivocally true that the Kurds in Syria were our best ally against the Islamic State. Who do you think was doing the foot soldier work against the Islamic State for the US Air Force in Iraq? It was the fucking Popular Mobilization Forces. It was like, so we've got these Syrian Kurds that are put on this pedestal. We can't possibly abandon them because they did this amazing work for us against the Islamic State. Whereas the people in Iraq who did this amazing work for us against the Islamic State are currently being murdered from the air by the United States. It's just, So yeah, the Popular Mobilization Forces. I'm not trying to make the argument that they're like unequivocally a good thing. They are not. My understanding is they're very complicit, if not the driving force behind a lot of killing of peaceful protesters in Iraq. The Popular Mobilization Forces themselves are a diverse range of groups, but there's no question to me that the people that we have been murdering from the sky, famously in the Soleimani execution, and the other guy who was in the car was the leader of the Popular Mobilization. I thought he was just a leader of one of the militias, but no, he was the leader across the board of the Popular Mobilization Forces. And the 22 people we killed this past week or the week before, they were our heroic allies against the Islamic State in Iraq, and we're murdering them. And this somehow makes sense somehow. So it's just fucking insane. And I need to make that video. Sorry, I'm trying to swear less in my talking, but that's something that is enraging that the Biden administration is doing. And yes, yeah, you can see why they're doing it, and you can't win everything at once, and you gotta pick your battles. That's all true, but it is just insane that this is how every president comes to power, is by murdering a whole bunch of people in Iraq and Syria. And now like it's not even like the Syrian Air Force that Trump probably didn't actually kill that many people, because it's arguable that I think there were 2 separate times that Trump hit the Syrian military. Like, yeah, these were the people who were barrel bombing people. Like, no, this time, we're hitting these Iraqi militias in Syria. They're basically just as much our allies against the Islamic State as the heroic Syrian Kurds were. And we're murdering them from the sky, and that's normal. Anyway. Christopher Murtaugh says Biden bombing Syria was George Collins' bigger dick foreign policy, probably for domestic measuring to prove his manhood. Exactly. I'm tough on this, so how about you let me do some JCPOA stuff, or how about you let me do some real negotiations in Yemen? It's exactly what it's for, but it's still just infuriating that this is what U.S. presidents do. Local Cool Extreme says, I wonder how many of these militia figures have active political power in Iraq, and how long until the U.S. straight up bombs an Iraqi government representative. I think we already have, because the Popular Mobilization Forces have quasi official status in Iraq. They had, and it's a struggle for the Iraqi government that these militias, because in 2014, June, July of 2014, even before, because I think the Iraq offensive started, the Iraqi military evaporated, and it was these militias that got together and stopped the Islamic State's rampage towards Baghdad. And of course, ever since, the Iraqi government has had a terrible time controlling these militias. Part of the efforts have been making the PMF, to some extent, quasi-official parts of government. The PMF absolutely has members that are in the Iraqi parliament. I think, yeah, we probably would have heard about it if like an actual, Iraqi parliamentarian was killed in a U.S. airstrike. But I think the head of the PMF might have actually been a parliamentarian. I don't know. The guy who was killed with Soleimani last January. Not 100% on that, but I think, yeah, I mean, it's insane. Okay, so that's what I have to say about bombing Syria. Gosh, we're already an hour and 10 minutes in. I got to pick this up a little bit. It's amazing that there's 9 people here. Chime in, say hi. Let me, if you have any questions about what I'm saying, please chime in. I love talking to Loga and Chris Murtaugh, but, like to hear from the other folks as well. Okay, bombing Syria, PMF sucks, scrutiny, yeah. Iran, yeah, man. Like Iranian maximum pressure continues, and it's so frustrating because, and I think every angry person that I retweet on Twitter, the same thing. The like it is insane that we blew up this deal, and now we want the Biden administration's official. Now Biden wants to talk to Iran, which is good. That's a step forward. That the Biden administration wants to talk to Iran about how we're going to get back into this deal, meaning we're going to convince Iran to give us more shit after we blew up the last deal. And yeah, Biden is different. Yeah, Biden is a different administration, but it is the exact same position that Trump had, because the whole point of maximum pressure is supposedly, for a lot of maximum pressure advocates, the point was the destruction of the Iranian people and state. But supposedly it was, we're just going to get a better deal with Iran. I think in his CPAC speech, even Trump said, "Yeah, if I had been reelected, we would have had a better deal with Iran. No, we would have had a war with Iran." So yeah, Biden is essentially just doing the same maximum pressure thing that Trump was. And yeah, the hope that things will get better has I think kept Iran from really escalating anything. But it's not great. I'd like to see more progress, but it's not April yet, so I'm not going to get super pissed. Right. Yeah, what I wanted to talk about here is that like what people say in confirmation hearings is not what they say is not necessarily what they believe or where they're going to push Iran policy. And I think I was falling into that trap a little bit, and certainly a lot of people on Twitter that I respect and follow were falling into that trap, getting angry about Wendy Sherman sort of seeming. I think Wendy Sherman specifically said, well, 2020 isn't 2015, which could mean literally anything. But getting very angry about how she wasn't instantly jumping into, enthusiasm for JCPOA in front of all the congressmen from Raytheon and Boeing and Lockheed Martin who desperately don't want the JCPOA to go forward. Trump's Latin American policy continues. This is also incredibly frustrating, and I'm drafting a larger produced piece on it now. I don't know if it'll happen for Tuesday because it's trying, just trying to run down all of Latin American history and where the Biden administration sort of fits in on that, which is a little overambitious, especially for a region I don't cover too much. So hopefully that'll be out on Tuesday, but I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't. But like what's really frustrating is that Trump's Latin America policy also continues. And I think that just briefly, what Trump's Latin America policy pissed me off so much because it was a jump right back to the 1980s. It was something that had really improved it was something that had really improved U.S. Latin American policy had dramatically improved under Bush, Clinton, Bush, Clinton, Bush, and Obama. I think more under Bush because we were so distracted. There was sort of a pink wave in Latin America. A whole bunch of socialist governments came to power. It's exactly the sort of thing that a Cold War um, U.S. president would have gotten, invading and suborning and cooing about. But I think because we were so focused on the Middle East, we just sort of let it go forward. And then Obama actually leaned into that with like, hey, let's stop it with this Cuban ridiculousness. Let's just back off. And the effects were tremendously positive. And what frustrated me so much about the Trump administration was that it was a jump back to the 1980s. We're picking governments in Venezuela. We did a coup in Bolivia. Just insane, and the results were stupid. And one of my bigger hopes for the Biden administration, I think more solid hopes for the Biden administration, was that they would very quickly jump back to the Obama approach, because it just made more sense and was working, and was a very easy way to sort of renounce Trump idiocy, and that has not happened like at all. In fact, the Biden administration is now taking steps to continue. So apparently, in order to crush Venezuela as horrifically with sanctions as we have to sort of certify that Venezuela is some sort of real threat to us, and that is not the case. That's bullshit. But I can't recall exactly what wing of the Biden administration did it, but apparently had certified that so as to continue our sanctions against them. Again, I think we can do what I did at the beginning of this presentation and say, oh, you can't do everything at once. And I think that makes sense. And almost the fact that the Biden administration is holding on to this can almost be seen as like, look, like they're really trying to do like Yemen and the JCPOA, which is stuff that like is sort of existentially important to the military contractors that own all of our Congress people. Like that's really, really difficult. And like getting the entire Florida congressional delegation at their throats as they're trying to do this tremendously difficult stuff isn't, like they're just choosing not to do that. Like, yes, like Venezuelans are starving, but they're still going to be starving after the sanctions are lifted. They won't be starving as much if we lift those sanctions. And I think it also becomes a great oil market thing now that the oil prices have spiked again. But like it's not as urgent as the JCPOA thing, and I think that's true. It's not as urgent as the sort of the June election where a hardliner is guaranteed to win power in Iran. Like it's not as urgent, and I can see that, but it's also just fucking insane that the Biden administration is continuing Trump's Latin America policy, and I hope to have a video talking more about that. Now I feel like I've promised that now, and I feel that I've bitten off a little more than I can chew. But we'll see. Maybe not on Tuesday, but hopefully before too long, we'll have a longer video on that. Okay, that's Trump's Latin American news continues. Okay, I think we're good on that. We talked about Afghanistan and what a tragedy that is. Tunisia's Amir Moussi. This is fascinating. I do not read enough about. I definitely owe you guys and the broader audience a Tunisia video and an Algeria video. I try to do a sort of long piece on each of those countries at least once a year. I think it's well, I've done it twice, but I think it's an interesting tradition to keep up because they're fascinating, important countries where I think the future of the Arab world is being formed there in ways that it's just not in those poor, sad, beat up Middle Eastern Arab countries. But I haven't got the hook yet. I don't know what I'm going to say about them yet. And if I don't have something interesting to say about their politics other than repeating myself, I'm not going to do the video. But as part of that research to try and find something interesting and hopeful to say about Tunisia, I sort of came across a long piece on Amir Moussi, and it's fascinating. So the most prominent female politician, the most prominent female politician in Tunisian history. I mean, I think going back to frickin' Carthage, probably. Yeah, I can't think of it. I've read a few books on Tunisia's in post-independence history, and yeah, I can't think of another female that was so even in. I mean, Tunisia's has been since independence one of the most progressive on women's issues, sort of more a more feminist oriented of countries. Still in the Middle East, still an Arab Amazigh country, so not progressive by any sort of normal Western standard. But yeah, Amir Musi is one of the more is sort of taking Tunisian politics by storm, and she's apparently quite anti-democratic, and her whole shtick is that things were better under the dictatorship, and we want the dictatorship back, which is, of course, confusing for all manner of people who want to write and say things about Tunisia. But it's kind of fascinating. And what's also hilarious is like, I think I could totally just make a series of videos comparing people to Napoleon III, because that is exactly the reference that comes up for me. Tunisia is one of those countries that was controlled by France for about 70 years. No, 80, 90 years. Well, the 1880s through 1956. 56, yeah, so 70, yeah, 70 years or so. And has French influence, and there are Francophone folks to be found. And it's fascinating to see this real parallel. Something I do a lot with the Arab Spring is I compare it, the Arab world, to sort of French political history, because the French have a vibrant, functioning representative democracy or what have you. But unlike the British or American models that I'd be more directly familiar with, it has been insanely tumultuous in France. They had, real threat of military coup as recently as the 1960s. They had their revolution in 1789 and didn't really make it to like a stable republic that lasted for more than a decade until like the 1870s. So like that's like a 70, 80-year period of consolidation to go from their initial revolution to democracy. And I think we could sort of see that kind of trajectory after the Arab Spring in the broader Arab world. And it's fascinating to see in a Francophone country somebody come up who's so much like Napoleon III. Napoleon III, I did a video comparing Xi Jinping to Napoleon III a while back, but here, I mean, the comparison is just so on point. Napoleon III ran after a period when folks were very frustrated with the constitutional monarchy they had at that point. I think 1830 to 1848 was how long that constitutional monarchy lasted. They were very frustrated, thought that was failed. Um, Napoleon III, or Louis Napoleon as he was known at the time, ran democratically, came up through the democratic system and won an election. I can't recall if it was for president. Yeah, I think it was for president. Won an election, quickly did a coup and restored the second, created the second empire in France, coming up through democratic processes. And it is fascinating in this Francophone country to see something that we're sort of trained to celebrate, a female politician, a very popular female politician in the Arab world, basically more or less openly wanting to do the Napoleon III thing, like very rather openly wants to be that wants to do away with Tunisia's democracy, and it's fascinating. I won't say horrifying. I mean, this is how democracy works. Democracy can vote to extinguish itself. It's happened multiple times. It's happened multiple times in French history, and it's happened all over the world. I think the only foreign history that we know in the United States is Hitler. And obviously, that was a pretty horrifying time when democracy decided to extinguish itself. But if a people wants to vote to extinguish its democracy, that's it's a goddamn shame. But it's not like I want Emir Musi to be suppressed. It's fascinating. I mean, she's actually running from the Neo Destorian Party, which was the party that Neo Destor was the party of Habib Bourguiba, the independence, um, the independence dictator, father of the country, who ruled the country from 1956 through the 1980s, um, until he was or 90s until he was replaced by the dictator that lost power in the Arab Spring. So yeah, I just thought that was kind of fascinating. That it's just reading this profile. It was just like this is very French, you know. And it would be a very sad way. It's always sad when a democracy goes, but it would be fascinating if that was sort of how this era of Tunisia's democracy experiment ended. Would be electing a woman who's sort of taking Napoleon III's political trajectory. It's kind of fascinating. And yeah, I mean, like, yeah, I should be. I wonder if this was a man, if I would be more against it, because I think I don't know if this was subtext or it just seems so obvious to me. It'd be clear that she'd be very anti-Muslim Brotherhood, so she'd probably be supported by the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and but if she wins an election, that's what the Tunisian people want, and that's how elections go sometimes. Even if it means no more elections. The And just with Tunisia, my standard story, as I've said over and over again, I don't think that you can really blame the leaders of Tunisian democracy for Tunisian democracy being such a failure, because when it was a dictatorship up until 2011, Tunisia was a vacation hotspot, famously, better run place in between two very prosperous oil dictatorships. In the entire period of time when Tunisia has been run by a democracy, one of those formerly prosperous oil dictatorships has been mired in civil war. And for, I guess, this is the 10-year anniversary of Tunisian democracy. And for 7 of those years, the world oil and gas price has been in the toilet. So Algeria, which is looking very shaky, the Algerian system is very shaky because they've now had 7 years of low oil prices. So Tunisia's really, like, the democratic leaders of Tunisia, I'm sure, are corrupt, inadequate, what have you, what everybody in the Tunisian street says they are. But also they've just been given a pretty crappy set of cards to deal with. And it would, of course, be a tremendous shame if Amir Morsi would sort of win just as, like, the Libyan civil war got settled and things started to make sense again. But that could be what happens. I don't know. It wouldn't be strange for the Arab world to have bad luck. Okay, enough about that. Christopher Murtaugh says, my first time. Awesome so far. I hope you're talking about this presentation. Arthur Curry says, hello. Hello, Arthur. Black Metal Silly says, the recent military industrial complex tweet of yours with POC lead person was cold. Yeah, that is not an idea that is original to me. Talking about about culture. Yeah, how I'm really pissed off about that Jack Ryan. I think you guys have, if you've been a patron for a while or follow me on Twitter, you probably heard me complaining about that Jack Ryan series on Amazon, which is a Tom Clancy thriller about how great it would be if the U.S. invaded Venezuela, or what a heroic job we've been doing in Yemen. This is no joke, like an Amazon Prime prestige series that Amazon poured millions and millions of dollars into, starring that guy from The Office. So in recent weeks, they're putting out another Tom Clancy thing, but it's starring Michael, what's his name? Michael something. The guy from the charismatic bad guy from the Black Panther films. And if it's starring an African American guy, then why would we be outraged? I think that is something that we had noticed. But yeah, Local Cool Extremes point is something you see made fun of a lot on Twitter. Is like more female drone pilots. You know, they call it military industrial complex feminism, or what is it? Yeah, feminist militarism. How we were supposed to be so excited that the CIA was headed. This is under the Trump administration. CIA was headed by a woman, perhaps for the first time. Gina Haspel, isn't it amazing? And you're like, yeah, she's also like one of the more complicit figures in U.S. torture. I think there was a period of time, may even be the case now, where the CEOs of all the biggest defense contractors were all women. Yay, girl boss! You know, like it's a thing, and it's irritating. Christopher Murtaugh says, "LOL." Arthur Curry says, "Did you talk about the $15 minimum wage vote?" Not really. I don't. I haven't been following the stimulus that closely. I think so. The stimulus vote was supposed to get a $15 minimum wage. That was something that was supposed to happen. There is a spectacularly weird thing that I don't really understand. So there's the Senate filibuster that apparently has evolved really only the past 10, 20 years. That means you can't get anything done without getting 60 votes in the Senate instead of majority rule. If you listen to like Matt Iglesias on Twitter, this wasn't the case even 20 years ago. But apparently, a lot of people are really invested in that being the case, including Democrats are really invested in that being the case. So they're doing the stimulus under something called budget reconciliation, which is another process. And there's only certain things that you can do under budget reconciliation that mean you can just do a 50-50 Senate, which means the Democrats can get through. And a lot of the things in the stimulus are apparently A-OK, but because it's mostly just about allocating funding, and that's something you can do on the Senate on a 50-50 basis. But the Senate parliamentarian, not an actual congressperson, but someone who's an attorney, I presume, who is in charge of like saying what the rules are in the Senate, said that actually, no, you can't do a minimum wage. You can't do a minimum wage as part of the budget reconciliation up and down majority process. So that can't be part of the package. And apparently enough Senate Democrats were like, okay, we got to do what the Senate parliamentarian tells us. So yeah, the minimum wage is not going to be in this package, which strikes me as a damn shame. I think there's been an emerging economics consensus that actually the sort of economics 101 idea that jobs go away if you do more minimum wage, actually it doesn't, like a lot of things you learn in economics 101 isn't actually the case. But I think there's a lot of Democrats actually who believe that that's not the case. Folks from Montana, West Virginia, a bunch of other folks who knows, and maybe it's the case in their generally poorer states that a $15 minimum wage would be prohibitive for some small businesses. I don't fucking know. But that's sort of my understanding of the contours of the debate. I don't have a real big what's the word? I just haven't gotten that invested. I don't know. I don't have an opinion. I think that's all I have to say about that. Brando Commando says, did you hear about Bolsonaro appointing a general to oversee Petrobras and a bunch of executives resigning in protest? Could a crisis in Brazil disturb the oil markets and further destabilize Saudi Arabia? Well, if Petrobras and Brazil were hurt, if there was a coup there, if there were sanctions, if there were just general disarray in Brazil, that would only help Saudi Arabia, right? Because that would be presumably some kind of supply disruption, and supply disruptions drive the oil price up. And to have a supply disruption that isn't even in Saudi Arabia's region to cause knock-on effects for them, physically, politically, would be great for Saudi Arabia. Brazil, I do not know anywhere near enough about what's happening in Brazil right now. I do know that Bolsonaro is a political figure who I think in his earlier career was quite explicit in in saying that Brazil was better when we had a military dictatorship. And as he gets less and less popular, as he gets more and more embattled, I think that's something we should very much be worried about. I think that's a good. I think Brando Commando is highlighting something that I have not researched enough. Is like, what are the chances of Brazil turning into a bit of a, going back to dictatorship? I think that the fact that Bolsonaro has made it thus far and has not been able to um, go in that direction. Not saying he's agitated and go in that direction, but like I do have a hope that like things have progressed far enough in Brazil that like any political figure is sort of constrained from taking that step. Obviously, putting a general in charge of the state oil company is not, a confidence building thing. Though Bolsonaro would, of course, see himself as 100% opposed to Chavismo, to sort of Venezuela and their approach to things, but politicizing the main, Venezuela, the second most important reason that Venezuela is in the horrifically bad plight that it is in right now is probably, U.S. intervention, and or maybe the third highest reason is sort of U.S. intervention and unnecessary cruelty, banking system sanctions, etc. The number one reason that Venezuela is the basket case it is today is that Chavez and Maduro politicized and destroyed their state oil company. So Bolsonaro jumping in to politicize his state oil company is a bad, bad thing. Brazil is very dependent on petroleum. It is not as dependent on oil and gas resources as Venezuela was. So, but yeah, no, that's interesting. I have not thought about the Brazil enough. Perhaps I ought to. That would be quite a new coup in Brazil would be like, oh shit, now we have to pay attention to Brazil thing. Um, let's see. And yes, I have spoken about the minimum wage vote. Brandon Commando says the word fascism is often misused, in my opinion, but having military figures take over the means of production is pretty dangerous and never works. Latest example is Egypt, and look where they are now. That's a very good point. Brandon Commando also pointing out that in Egypt, famously the military controls way too much of business life in Egypt, and it has not worked out very well at all. Um, yeah, so Arthur Curry points out that the stimulus bill passed right now, as Logan mentioned earlier. The stimulus bill has passed, which is amazing, without the $15 minimum wage, which is very disappointing to a lot of people. The best part of it is 3,000 a year per kid, 6 to 17, 3,600 kids 0 to 6. Yeah, that child credit, I think, is a pretty fantastic thing. I know it's anti-feminist and misogynist of me, but I am, despite taking absolutely no efforts in that direction myself, I am sort of pro-natalist. I do think that the plummeting fertility rate in the United States is pretty horrifying. Think we need vastly more immigration, and also we need to make it easier for people to have children. I have a lot of friends who've had a lot of children, but that's because I have multiple degrees, and most of my contemporaries make a lot more money than I do, and are sort of in the top 5% of the country, and they can have a bunch of kids. That is no longer the case for most of the people in the United States. So I think that this child credit here is a very cool thing that I have not researched enough. And I think there's a ton of good stuff in the stimulus. I think there's good. God, there was something else I was reading about that was like surprisingly good. I mean, I'm sure there's good infrastructure stuff in there. I know there's good environmental stuff in there. There's it's $1.9 trillion. There's just a lot of things in there. And as soon as we're done here, I'm gonna hop on Twitter and see what people are saying about it. But yeah, no, I think Arthur's pointed out that Arthur Curry's pointed out that that child credit is a very good thing. Mert Mufti says regarding the 15 an hour minimum wage, I wonder if states cannot set a minimum themselves as part of their business license renewal process. Yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting approach. State minimum wages. I think we've definitely got city minimum wages. Does California have a state minimum wage? It'd probably be the only place I would think that would pull it off. Um, yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like I said, not a policy area that I've thought about a ton. Local Extreme says, I think the chances of Bolsonaro, presumably, going dictator are extremely slim, not as long as Lula is still up and about. He is immensely popular. I think left wing Mahathir without the authoritarianism. So, well, the thing is, if you're a dictator, you can take Lula and put a bullet in his head. That's the fact that Lula has tremendous popularity and power behind him is not something that would make Bolsonaro less likely to do a coup if he could get away with it. But that is a key question. Can he get away with it? And hopefully he can't. I think obviously seeing Lula back in charge of Brazil would be fantastic. And I say that as a sort of a conservative leaning guy who tends to prefer neoliberals in charge. Bolsonaro is a lunatic, anarchist. I don't like to throw around fascist too much, but there's certainly leanings he has that are quite fascistic. He's a nightmare, and the one of the most disastrous coronavirus responses in the world that he's inflicted on his country is not something you would ever see under Lula or Dilma. I think unquestionably supported by elements in the United States and sort of the broader sort of pro business lobby. The fucking Economist, a periodical I have less and less respect for every year, endorsed Bolsonaro, which is just at the time people put that up and were like, wow, this is not gonna age well, and oh boy did it not. So yeah, it would be fantastic to see Lula back in charge in Brazil. I don't know that he'd be able to be as successful as he was the first time around, but it would definitely be better than what we have now. So yeah, Brazil, bit of a mess. Okay, geez, God, man, we've been at this for a while. We only got 18 minutes left, and the Algeria. The Hirak is back. This is sort of the new development. One of the reasons I wanted to do another Algeria video, but I basically about a year ago I said, I did my second Algeria video, and was like, look, like the junta's got to go, and the junta's still there. The military oligarchy that has controlled Algeria since independence in 1964. 62. Yeah, they are flubbing. They are failing. In the beginning of 2019, the Hirak street movement. I kind of, what does Hirak stand for anyway? HIRAK. That is the name of the Algerian peace movement. I guess you can't call. Who was I talking with recently? Who was like, it's the Arab Spring was napping and now it's woken up again. In the beginning of 2019, you saw in Algeria and Sudan chiefly sort of real movement, and you saw 2 decades-long heads of state fall. After the fall of Bouteflika, not particularly dramatic, he just said, okay, I guess I'm not going to run for my 5th term. See you guys. The Algerian oligarchy has taken a number of different approaches to the Hirak movement, trying to suppress it, trying to co-opt it, trying to answer some of its charges. The Hirak movement remains unsatisfied, quite rightly unsatisfied with the moves that the Algerian government has made. So what has happened over the past 2 weeks is after the coronavirus, I'm not sure what the status of vaccination in Algeria is, but after essentially taking the year off because of coronavirus, the Hirak movement is back in the streets. and are once again sort of protesting and asking for the removal not just of visit President or Prime Minister Tabune, but also the entire ruling oligarchy, le pouvoir, as they are known, the power. Um, I don't know. Like for me, it's kind of like I think the Iraq has been very lucky in that they have not won yet for the past 2 years because like being in charge of Algeria right now is a really crappy job. I think that while I think that the Algerian Oil Authority continues to be vastly better run, I think that the closest analog with between Algeria, I think there are a lot of parallels. I think Algeria is not saying it's a well-run country. I'm saying it's a better run country than Venezuela. But I think the parallels between Algeria and Venezuela are very strong. And while Algeria hasn't gotten to the point where they can't figure out how to pump oil and gas anymore, I think that in the new arena, the new sort of oil and gas price dispensation, they're in some real trouble. I think actually they're going to get a little break over the next year or so because we've got oil prices are high again, but it's Algeria really, really, really needs to figure out what it's going to do beyond oil and gas. And while yeah, probably a more democratic system would be better at figuring out what that might be. It's not like the Tunisians have figured anything out. I don't know. I'm definitely not anti-democracy. I'm very pro-democracy, very pro-Arab democracy. I just feel like if the Iraq won, certainly if it won 2 years ago, and if it won today, the I feel like they'd be set up for very quick failure because Algeria is just like its economy and its prospects. It's just does it needs to figure out what's next, and I kind of feel like what Algeria needs to do is figure out what's next before it tries to figure out what a political system is next. And I have no answer for what that might be. I do remember, I walked around Algeria in number of years back. One of the most stunningly beautiful downtowns I've ever seen. Like one of the most I mean, it was built as a, you know, 20th arrondissement of Paris. It's gorgeous, and it should be like the tourist mecca of the world. But can you support the Algerian system to the extent that petroleum did on tourism? I just don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what Algeria's next step is, but I know it needs one, and I don't think the solution is necessarily political. So I don't know. So on Thursday, talking about oil production, yeah. So shale's dead, guys. It was a really fascinating thing. Um, Everybody expected Saudi Arabia to what's the word I'm looking for here? Okay, back up. So, Saudi Arabia, in a deal with Russia, since the fall of 2016, has been restricting its oil production in a deal with OPEC more broadly. But what matters, I mean, Saudi Arabia and Russia are vastly, it's called OPEC Plus because Russia has never been a technical member of OPEC, though for the past, gosh, 4.5 years now, I think it was November 2016, has been acting in negotiated coordination with Saudi Arabia. So November 2016, they curtailed their production in an effort to hold up prices. It was supposed to be a 6-month thing. It ended up being a 4-year thing. This deal famously fell apart when the coronavirus crush in demand happened. I think in March and April of last year, Russia refused to limit its production more. So Saudi Arabia said, fuck it, we're opening the taps, and went absolutely, apeshit. That's where we got that amazing, was it March or April of last year? We had, a futures contract close at negative $36 for a barrel of oil. Like people you'd actually pay to get rid of the obligation to buy a barrel of oil, something I don't think we've ever seen before. And then I think Trump basically told Saudi Arabia to knock it off, and then Russia and Saudi Arabia got back to limit things. 2 months ago, January of this year, Saudi Arabia was again having trouble, um, getting Russia to agree to curtail things, to curtail production, to drive up prices more. But instead, they did the opposite of what they did last year and just said, "Fuck it, we can't get OPEC or Russia to agree to cut production, so we're just taking 1 million barrels of our own off unilaterally. We're just going to do it. Prices are too low. We're going to jack up the prices." And it happened. It happened successfully. We've also got demand coming back on stream as it seriously looks like um, the oil price will, as it seriously looks like demand is gonna come back, or at least is starting to come back. So we've got, I think, gosh, like Sunday. Saturday is not. I don't think is not a market day. Sunday is, I think, because Saudi Arabia is open. But yeah, I think we could have $70 barrel prices again, which is something we have not seen since I think um, I tweeted something recently, but I think we haven't seen $70 a barrel of oil since early 2019 for WTI or Brent. So we're getting back up to like real prices here. But what's important to remember is just how extraordinarily artificial this is. It's because Saudi Arabia had limited things through a deal with Russia and OPEC, and then just took another 1 million barrels of oil a day off of the market as well. What's fascinating about last Thursday is the reason uh, is that what it indicates about what Saudi Arabia thinks about shale oil. $60, which is something we passed just this past week, is typically the point where it used to be that at about $60, U.S. shale oil producers would start amping up production. They would amp up this production not because it was a good business, but because Wall Street at that point would start giving them tons and tons of money. The problem is, after the third or fourth time this happened, Wall Street realized we're not getting any of this money back. It's estimated that the shale patch, the oil miracle, basically burned up about $300 billion of Wall Street money over the past decade. That's just money they invested that they never saw again. And especially after the last bruising year, Wall Street's just not interested in doing that anymore. And Saudi Arabia thinks that that they don't need to limit things anymore, because they don't think that shale is going to come on stream again to the extent that it, threatens Saudi Arabia's market share. And I don't know. So far, that seems to be what's happening. So it'll be very interesting. I think oil prices, after being very not interesting for a very long time, are about to get much more interesting. The question now is like, are we going to see like real, like back to 2014 prices? I think probably not, but we are going to see. I mean, if we get back into the 80, $90 dollars a barrel of oil, yeah, we're going to see some real pain at the pump in the United States and Europe and China, which also means an accelerated case for the electric car. So yeah, this is exciting stuff. This is interesting stuff that's happening right now. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say about that. Myanmar, there's really not much to say, and this is good because we're running out of time. But yeah, the people of Myanmar are attempting to save their democracy. They're out in the streets, and I personally, I mean, one of my formative experiences, 34-year-old, 33-year-old, was participating in the Gezi riots protest movement against Erdogan in Turkey that was unsuccessful. But one of the reasons I, allowed myself to participate in that was that the Turkish government, despite what was advertised, was not very brutal at all. I think in a month of countrywide uprisings, like 5 people died. One of them was a cop. The Turkish government is very brutal out east, but where I was, it's fairly safe. In Myanmar, it is not safe. in just a week of uprising. And I think Myanmar is a smaller place than Turkey, not a dramatically smaller place. 60 people have been killed by just cops doing live fire. These are not inadvertent. These are not tramplings. These are not there's so many people and someone had a heart attack. This is the Myanmar military dictatorship that has done a coup against their sort of half democratic system that they had already controlled. Is killing their people. And it's funny. I wasn't. I think it was on YouTube. Like I was getting pushback from people. Oh yeah, you really care about the genocidaires. There's no question that the Myanmar people were too eager to make excuses for genocide. I mean, some were. There were also very brave Myanmarese journalists who were exposing that genocide. But it was the military dictatorship that did the genocide. So I'm not sure why we should be excited that the Myanmar dictatorship is killing its own people instead of other people. I don't know. Anyway, it's just very sad. And as someone who knows how powerful and inspiring it can be to be in a sort of crowd of people fighting for your rights, it's quite sad seeing people being murdered for it. So yeah, heart goes out to Myanmar. It'd be nice if there were a way forward. I don't really see a way forward. I think it's likely that the dictatorship will sort of consolidate power again. It'd be nice if they didn't, but also it's not fun to watch people die to try and make that happen. Anyway, okay, Ethiopia, it's getting worse. I've got I've got a number of videos on sort of Ethiopia's war, talking about how it makes political sense for Abiy Ahmed, the leader. But the consensus seems to be that it's getting grimmer. And a lot of folks are wondering what exactly Eritrea has been up to in the northern Tigray region. Why won't Abiy Ahmed let any humanitarian or media outlets in there? How horrifying is it? These are all questions we need answers to. War, it sucks. Like, it's not good. It's real bad. I just felt like saying that again. I don't know. Not exactly sure what I was saying, but it has been almost 2 hours. So I guess we're going to move on from that. Okay, questions. Brando Commander says, articles were saying that the Biden administration is trying to convince King Salman to put forth whoever was previously in line for the Saudi throne. I think that's one of the dumber things that I've seen that too. I think there was the New Yorker article may actually just argued for that. MBS, before MBS was, I think, I think in January of 2015, King Salman took the throne. I'm not sure if MBS was automatically made second in line at that point, or if it was made second in line after. But the second in line until mid 2017 for 2 years was Mohammed bin Nayef. And Mohammed bin Nayef, or MBN as he's known, is sort of a famously very close to the U.S. security state. He was our guy for attacking terrorism. He was our guy for attacking Al Qaeda. He's sort of our thing. Hear a lot of rumors about him that he's not may not be of sterling personal character, but I don't know how true any of that is. So he was our guy. It seemed likely that the U.S. was very much in favor of him being next in line, as he was. And even putting MBN as next in line was sort of a revolution in Saudi Arabia, because he would have been, I think, the first grandson of. So every ruler of Saudi Arabia since Saudi Arabia existed has been the son of Saudi Arabia's founder, Ibn Saud, a guy who died in like 19 in the 1950s, but was still having kids. He probably had dozens of kids. And King Salman and every king before him has been a son of Ibn Saud, the first king of modern Saudi Arabia. Even MBN was like a step forward because he was a grandson, just like MBS is a grandson, but he was also much more well established. He had the relationship with the United States. He's a guy in his 50s. So he was pushed out to make MBS the crown prince halfway through 2017. I think MBN was initially, yes, I'm so excited about this. I wish him the best of luck. But I think has now eventually ended up under house arrest to some extent, or who knows if he's even alive. He's probably still alive. He does have that very strong relationship with the United States, and I think MBS is looking for less reasons to piss off the United States at this point, certainly post Khashoggi. But yeah, so this idea that like, oh, we're gonna put like the gerontocracy back in charge, or we're gonna put our guy back in charge, like MBS is damaging lunatic, but like he does get something very right, which is that Saudi Arabia needed a disruptor. Saudi Arabia needed to be shaken up in very real ways, and that is the opposite of what MBN is. MBN is a return to consensus, gerontocracy, ossification, and almost certainly a return to a more extreme Wahhabism. That might be unfair, but one thing that MBS has done is that he has really distanced Saudi Arabia away from Wahhabism. What that means for its foreign policy is less clear. But yeah, I mean, the religious police are no longer a thing there. A lot of the dissidents that are getting murdered by MBS's regime are religious fanatics. They're also crusaders for women's rights, for democracy, for people who wrote something less than perfectly respectful in a blog once. And even for the religious fanatics, they should not be in jail and executed. But yeah, I mean, there are like real changes, there are real shakeups that MBS is attempting to do that Saudi Arabia desperately needs. This sort of half-assed idea, like, oh, we're just going to talk to King Salman, and I think as a short-term message to MBS, like, hey, Bucko, like, get in line. You're not our only option. Okay, that makes sense. But if there's like a serious attempt by the U.S. government to like do like a regime change or rolling back the clock to 2015, like I think that's actually what's going to happen. I think that like MBS, if something blows up, it's not guaranteed that I mean, he could. There are other factions in the Saudi royal family that could take power, and for any number of reasons, I think it's quite possible that if we get a stock market crash in the United States and a sort of pull back from the whole tech investment thing, I think it will look like so MBS will have quite clearly lost to the tunes of hundreds of billions of dollars for Saudi Arabia. I think that's the most likely scenario, is that then he loses popularity and then the U.S. sort of colludes in replacing him with MBN or some other more boring consensus figure. And then that boring consensus figure, who will always be unpopular, will last for another 2 years before the Saudi system falls entirely. So, like, I don't think it makes much sense for the Biden administration to try to bring that about. I think it's kind of silly. I think MBS is, the guy for now. Yeah, like just because I'm against the Saudi system doesn't mean I'm excited to start playing regime change games with it. So will oil hit $100? And do you still stand by your Saudi Arabia is finished video after getting it wrong about their influence on the stock market? Yes, I absolutely stand by Saudi Arabia is finished by 2030. Because yeah, the stock market, it's just not going to continue to be this gangbusters for the next 10 years. It'd be great if it was, because shit, like, I do have some investments. But I think that Saudi Arabia has now tied itself. I think MBS has been more successful in um, extending the range of his regime through the use of Wall Street than I expected. I think I was wrong about that. I don't think it's a long-term solution. I think that with the next stock market crash in the United States, Saudi Arabia and MBS in particular are going to lose an extraordinary amount of money for Saudi Arabia, quite possibly at the same time as electric cars start having a more consistent impact on the oil and gas markets, which would be cataclysmic for MBS. So I think it's, yeah, I don't back off from my sense that Saudi Arabia remains doomed. So I think that, oh no, I have one more thing that I was going to talk about that I can't really talk about because I don't understand. But yeah, any more questions? Because we are at the 2 hour mark. I'll just keep going. You guys, are the patrons, you want me to talk about more shit? I'll talk about more shit. But within reason, I'll just keep going. I think we're almost at the end of what I have one more item to talk about, and then it's all questions. So if you got any questions, anything you want me to chat about, uh, chime in. There's 11 people here, not just Logo, Brando, Arthur, Mert, and Chris. Okay. A silver lining in all the Myanmar protests, many people there have begun to openly question their previous positions on the Rohingya. Yeah, that sounds good. I don't think the humanity of the Myanmar protesters who are being shot in the streets by the government is contingent on upon what's the word I'm looking for? Is contingent upon their opinions on what the people killing them may or may not have done to the Rohingya. But yeah, no, I think that is good. Rohingya genocide was a bad thing. I still need to make a video about. Didn't answer my question about $100 oil. Yeah, no, of course. Like, I think that it's entirely possible that we could get up to $100 oil. We could get up to $150 oil again. I don't think it's likely this year. I think it's possible. I mean, it's going to be interesting. Like, I'm drafting a video. Like, it's going to be very interesting. Like, what happens when, because Canada right now just isn't viable. Like, much of the, not all of it, but much of the Canadian oil industry. I think there was an article yesterday about, they just took 500,000 barrels of tar sand oil off stream. It's just not viable anymore at all. It just doesn't make sense. Hasn't made sense for 6 or 7 years to produce that stuff. And yeah, even if we get to $70 a barrel, it still doesn't make much sense to produce that stuff. I think more and more places in the world, as Venezuela is like that, are just going to stop producing, and people are going to, and that will mean in the short term, like in a 6 to 10 month, 6 to 12 month term, we can start seeing some really insane price jumps, like the way we used to when China was on stream. But when China was doing rampaging growth. So yeah, like I think that we will see over $100 barrel oil. Will we see it this year? I don't know. But I do think that if we do see $150 barrel oil again, it will, it could last for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, but it will be like the last time we will see that because there will be a rampage towards electric cars in that case. It'd be fascinating because the oil price is already up. The price of gas in the United States is already up at the pumps, as I think Donald Trump, or was it Eric Trump, was tweeting about earlier this week. And yeah, it'll be fascinating to see how that impacts electric car adoption, how that impacts. We've been hearing we couldn't possibly make enough electric cars because we'll run out of cobalt and nickel. Week or so back, nickel prices cratered. So that seems to not be true so far. But do people just hate electric cars and they won't buy them even if it's by far the cheaper option? Which, if oil prices spike, will be the case by the end of this year. I don't know. It's all exciting stuff. We shall see. Um, okay, I'm gonna just say bond market. Okay, so something happened this week that is extraordinarily important, and I don't understand at all. What happened was the 10-year Treasury yield spiked dramatically, resulting in a great deal of panic in the stock market. And man, I just don't understand anything that I just said right there. I listened this morning to a hour-long podcast on what happened this week with the Odd Lots podcast, some Bloomberg finance reporters talking to I think a guy who's actually a trader in treasuries. And man, yeah, I don't fucking get it, man. Like I spent most of March of last year like frantically reading people like Adam Tooze and Nathan Tankis and like all kinds of like finance Twitter stuff. Like everyone was getting crazy about the coronavirus. I was like in this weird silo of finance Twitter being like, holy shit, what is the Federal Reserve doing? And So I understood a little bit of that podcast, but I don't understand enough. So I meant to say something clever about like the Fed versus the bond vigilantes, and listening to that podcast. Like apparently that narrative doesn't make any sense. It used to be, you had the bond vigilantes. The classic quote that you see a lot in these articles is James Carville, who was a very colorful political strategist for Bill Clinton, said that, when I die, I want to come back as the bond market because then you can intimidate everybody. And it really did. It was something that used to apply to the United States and still applies. I mean, that's what a lot of Turkish economics reporting is about. Is like, what are foreign creditors going to put up with from the Turkish government or what have you? And that used to apply to the United States, as the James Carville quote indicates, but now it apparently doesn't anymore because economics just doesn't make sense anymore since 2008. So it's frustrating for me. There's like a couple levels of misunderstanding. There's something about the dynamics of the bond market that are very confusing to me. So like if bond yields rise, that means that the price of bonds has gone down and anybody that holds bonds is in a worse position. That's confusing for me. And then there was a bunch of ways that people understood the world before 2008, that, bond markets were tremendously powerful. And even the United States had to pay attention to whether people were willing to buy their debt or not. And that sort of broke in 2008 with things like quantitative easing and central banks just sort of most on the largest scale in the United States, but also throughout Europe and I believe Japan, just sort of central banks just buying the government debt, which is just sort of that's very confusing. That went up to a much higher degree, and in 2020 it went to even higher degree. So nothing sort of makes sense anymore. But this past week, there was some kind of movement in the bond market that made people think like, oh, maybe things are the way they used to be. But the podcast was like an hour of saying, actually, no, it's not. And I just don't understand. But it's very important. I hope that made some sense. I doubt it did. Anyway, okay, these other questions. Thoughts on Texas and some other red states opening up? Really fascinating sort of couple days on Twitter where Texas started opening up, and then we heard just outrage everywhere. And then Connecticut, which is a very blue state, and actually has also opened up, and everyone's like, well, no, but we understand Connecticut's just doing this better, right? And I think there is an argument to be made that Connecticut is doing this better because I think Connecticut is keeping the mask mandate as they open up restaurants and whatnot. Um, uh, And also, Connecticut is one of the best in the country as far as vaccination rates. I think now anybody over the age of 55 in Connecticut can get a vaccination because they've already vaccinated everybody over 65 and everybody at risk. But I think there is a double standard here. And I think that Abbott, the governor of Texas, has been a little too much of is being a bit of a performative asshole about it. I think that just because a governor says, business is open now. It doesn't mean that businesses aren't going to continue to do common sense things. And also, there's this, which may be surprising to a foreign audience. There's never been a real lockdown in the United States. In Connecticut, where I am right now, this is mom and dad's house, and I spent a lot of time. There have been restaurants that have always been open. There's always been indoor dining. Most people don't do it because, we're in a fairly well-educated area and people aren't fucking morons. But yeah, indoor dining's always been open. It's always been, and I think that's been the case throughout the United States. There aren't real restrictions here the way that there have been in Europe, which is why we've had, and there never have been, which is why we've had such an outsizedly horrible um, experience with this, despite the fact that most of us live in a car-based culture to the extent that nobody else in the world does. Um, and not just people are like, oh no, public transit doesn't matter for COVID. Yeah, but like just the fact that we are such a fundamentally isolated household of so many households of one kind of thing, plus the car culture. Like there are a lot of reasons why the United States, and we're also absurdly wealthy and can do all kinds of things that other places can't. There are all kinds of reasons why the United States should have had a much better COVID experience than anybody else, and we now are going to because the vaccines. I mean, we're all going to be vaccinated by anybody who wants to be vaccinated. It's going to be vaccinated by the end of May, which will not be the case elsewhere in the world. So anyway, I'm sort of blathering, but I don't know. I have um, pretty firmly stayed out of, with the exception of like one angry video reacting to particularly dumb statements by another YouTube channel. I've pretty much stayed out of the sort of COVID arguments because they don't really appeal to me, and I'm not a public health expert. Okay. Brandon Commander says, unfortunately, Abbott already has a contingency plan. He'll blame it on immigrants. Yeah, that's also a particularly ugly thing, is that Texas Governor Abbott came out one day, actually the same day maybe, and was like, fuck it, everything's open, stop, don't be afraid, go do business, have fun. And then was like, but we're getting COVID from the immigrants that Biden's letting in, which is just beyond parody. Yeah, fucking Texas Governor Abbott. He's also the guy who most responsible, the guy the buck stops with for the fact that half the state, almost froze to death a couple weeks back. So he's not really a big winner this year. Christopher says. Christopher Murtaugh says. Tar sands oil hasn't made long-term sense for a decade, yet Alberta, our Texas, keeps doubling down on it. Dumb, dumber, and dumbest. Yeah, it's sad. I mean, I remember back in Turkey, I had a good friend. She was from Alberta, and she was like, yeah, I mean, it's like, she was talking to her 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. She was like, yeah, I mean, Alberta, it's grim, it's such a, the boom for Alberta ended in 2014, and she was talking about it being grim back there then, 5 years ago. I mean, it's got to be pretty horrific. Unfortunately, that's about all they got. I just read this amazing comic book by Joe Sacco. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He's famous for doing graphic novel reporting on the wars in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia. He did a Palestine one, and most recently he just went up to northern Canada and sort of documented what it's like to be in, I guess First Nations is what they say in Canada, and sort of Native American, Native Canadian First Nations up in the far north of Canada, and how invested they have become in this oil and gas future that just isn't coming anymore. And yeah, Alberta's got the same problem. It's a grim story, and yeah, one that's I think ending. Which should be a topic of glee for the environmentally minded. I mean, tar sands oil extraction is just incredibly environmentally ruinous on an old-fashioned like pollution basis, but also just how the intensity of the energy that you're using to get out just a little bit of oil is also insane. So yeah, the end of tar sands is a good thing for humanity, but it's got some real nasty costs for those regions. Some Canadians with sort of some nasty politics that it's easy to not be a fan of, depending on where you're coming from, but also for a lot of Indigenous folks who were hoping to get some economic transformation out of that they did to some extent, and that's ending. I mean, I may be comparing apples and oranges. I mean, there are non-tar sands oil and gas resources in Canada and quite possibly in the far north that continue to be viable, but they are difficult places to get to, and even if they're not the environmentally ruinous and expensive tar sands version, if they're hard to get to, then they're earlier on the chopping block than Texas or Saudi Arabia or some place that's close to easily accessible to water. Okay, Farzan, what if Saudi Arabia finds another survival escape investment after the stock market crashes? Well, anything's possible. But I don't know. I suppose that's possible. It's finding that magical. There are very few people, even very wealthy people, who find that next magical investment. I don't think I've made a huge secret about the fact that I come from a fairly comfortable background, and the secret to maintaining a fairly comfortable background. And I think the secret for almost all, I wouldn't say that we're, by U.S. standards, we are not dramatically wealthy, but we are, comfortable and have been for decades and decades. And the strategy that is used by people like my family and by people who are much more legitimately wealthy is when a stock market crash happens, you just don't sell. You hold on to whatever investments you held on to. You look at them, you go, oh my God, that went down a terrible amount. And that's really embarrassing and horrible. And then you wait 5 years, and then, most of those investments, those companies still exist. And, you watch it go up and up and up and up and again, and you don't sell it then either. You just sort of, there are, I think, my father has shares of Disney that his parents bought in the 40s. You just sort of sit on stuff. And the problem is that if a big crash happens, Saudi Arabia won't have that opportunity especially because of the tech and risky nature of a lot of the investments that they've gone for. It's not like Saudi Arabia's tech investments are all in Amazon and Microsoft, things that are likely to be here 20 years from now. They're in, things like Uber and Tesla, which Tesla's lost, 30% of its value this year. And I think Saudi Arabia famously sold off a lot of its Tesla stock before its massive run up over the past year or so. I think that when the next crash happens, the crashes tend to be broad based. It's not like, who knows? There is usually one investment that does, fantastically well. But usually it's a whole class of investments that people sort of shift to, and it's stays undervalued for a while, and then things sort of start creeping up, or they stay. And that was contradictory what I just said here. But what the problem for MBS is going to be is that the stock market's going to crash, and he's going to have a lot of stuff that's completely valueless. He's going to have a lot of stuff that's worth a lot less than what he put into it. And that is going to be a real political problem. So it's not like Saudi Arabia has the leisure with its public investment fund to say, it's worth half to a quarter of what it was when we put into it 5 years ago. And well, let's just wait, 5-10 years, and then it'll get back up there. It's cool. No, this is sort of money that Saudi Arabia needs to diversify and use for other purposes. So I don't think Saudi Arabia has the will have the leisure to sort of figure out the next thing. And I don't think they're going to just sort of figure out the right thing to do. Like, oh, they're going to put it in this magic Bitcoin thing or cryptocurrency, and they're going to preserve their value. I just don't think that's how markets work on the scale that's grand enough to survive Saudi Arabia. I think that there's been this oddity of this sort of never ending historical by historical standards, this never ending ballooning in asset prices that I just don't that has gone on for 12 years now, that I don't believe is going to be sustainable in the long term in ways that are going to work for Saudi Arabia. That makes sense. Anyway, Rami says nobody understands how money markets work anymore. Bingo. Thank you for backing me up in that, Rami, because I certainly fucking don't. Arthur Curry, I mean, Alberta does have a conservative government that is in bed with oil lobbyists. Well, it makes better, but what else are you going to be in Alberta? I mean, Alberta is a whole region of Canada that exists because of oil and gas extraction, and it's going to be very rough arriving at a position where that's no longer true. Local Cool Extreme says, "Is money even real anymore? I don't know. Does it matter? Absolutely. Kind of in the middle. Yes. Thanks, Sarah. My dad has mail for me. It's exciting stuff. Is money even real anymore? Does it even matter? Yes, it absolutely matters. Farzam, I also read somewhere that Lebanon is the only currency left backed by gold. If true, are there pros, cons? Any reason they're not switching to fiat currency? I don't think that's true, Farzam. I think that Lebanon's currency is unfortunately, like its central bank has a lot of dollar liabilities, which is a very dumb thing for a central bank to get caught up on. There possibly that there's officially a gold standard, but if you've got I don't think that's true. But I don't know enough to say that it's absolutely not true. Rami Ali says money is real, but it is a constantly changing phenomenon. That is very true, Rami. Local Cool Stream says, have Pa and Ma Morris already been vaccinated? Yes, my dad has gotten 2 of his vaccinations, gotten 2 shots, and Mom is up for her 2nd shot, I believe, next Monday, which is very exciting. And if I were 15 years older in Connecticut, where I live right now, I would be able to get a shot, which would be very cool. All right, folks, it has been 2.5 hours. I think I am losing coherence. I'm very grateful to all of you for being here. 10 folks. That's very exciting. I don't think I've ever had 10 people be here for a patrons only newscast before. It's a new era. If you have any last questions, I will answer them. But I do think it's probably time to sign off 2.5 hours in, because I am making less sense. I don't need to spiel for you guys. You guys are all generous enough to be supporters already on Patreon. I'm grateful for every view and comment and like and interaction of every sort. But it really is you folks who keep this going. It would not be possible or viable without you guys. You guys are the More Freedom Foundation, and very grateful for that you folks are here and that you continue to be here, and because I would not be here without you guys. So thank you kindly. All right. Yes, Fadel, you are late. It's been 2.5 hours, and I am signing off. And I'm very grateful. Thank you all so much. And that's free.